Welcome to Understanding Islam Series 3. This is episode 7, when we're going to have a look at the Islamic understanding of politics and the organization of society. Let me first just remind you that if you've missed any programs in this series or in the earlier 2 series of Understanding Islam, they're all available on the on-demand section of the Ahl al-Bayt website, and that for each week there is an article available to be downloaded from my own website. So let's turn then to the question of politics. Well, Islam is guidance for the whole of human life, and the way that the society organizes itself is part of that. The way that society organizes itself is called politics, and therefore politics also comes under Islamic influence and Islamic guidance. Now, this guidance is given by God to humankind through the revelations and the books to various prophets from the time of Adam up until the last revelation to Prophet Muhammad. And that revelation then is applicable, is universal, is relevant for all generations that follow. So it is universal in terms of its global application, and it's universal also in terms of being there for all times. However, it needs to be interpreted and put into practice in different ways throughout human history, because human societies differ, the situation at that century differs, and so we have a constant need to interpret and imply that one universal guidance into each new situation. Now, the original and first interpreter of the Qur'an was Prophet Muhammad himself. Because he was sinless and he was protected from error, he was an infallible guide of the young Muslim community in Mecca and Madina. The way that he put it into practice becomes normative for later generations, all subsequent generations of Muslims. The first thing to say is that Muhammad never considered himself to be somebody above the law, somebody who could make whatever laws he decided on a whim that suited himself. But instead, he always saw himself as being the servant of God and therefore being under the law like every other human being. Secondly, he was the single leader of the community, not only the spiritual leader, but he also organized the affairs of the community, the political leader. He was the final arbiter of disputes within the community, the leader of the judiciary or the legal system, and also, when it was necessary, he called the men to take up arms and to go into battle in order to defend the community. So he was the military leader. And this model of single leadership becomes important in the Islamic system. However, Muhammad wasn't a dictator in the sense that he just applied his will and didn't care or listen to anybody else. He took the traditional Arab pattern of shura, of consultation. Now, this was the way that the Arab clan chiefs would organize themselves before the time of the rise of Islam, when if there was a matter to be discussed and decided, the clan chiefs would come together in a consultative meeting, a council, and then a decision would emerge from that with which they would all agree. And Muhammad took this same model, but he made a significant change, which was that he was consulting the whole of his community and not just the elite leaders. And in particular, specifically, he also was consulting the women of his community and not just the men. Now, this principle of shura becomes very important in Islamic understanding, because you remember that every human being, according to Islam, has the two great dignities of being the abd and being the khalifa of God. The abd, the obedient servant; the khalifa, the regent or agent of God upon earth. Now, how are human beings to exercise that in an Islamic political system? Well, the principle is through a system of consultation, through a system based on shura, in which the wisdom, the expertise, and the responsibility of every individual is brought to bear on the affairs of the society. So shura becomes a very important tool in discerning the right way forward. What is important here is that the people are not ultimately sovereign. In other words, the people are not at liberty to make whatever laws they choose as long as it's passed by a majority. Sovereignty rests with God. God has given guidance in the Qur'an and in the prophetic example. And therefore there are certain limits within which the laws in an Islamic culture or society can be laid down, can be derived. Within those limits, then, the people play their part, listening to the guidance of God, seeking to understand it, informing one another, and then coming to a consensus, a way forward. So the people are always operating within the bounds of the Qur'an, the revealed text, and the prophetic example, the Sunnah. Now, we can see this lived out in the time immediately after the time of the Prophet in two different patterns. If we take the Sunni pattern, for example, first, then we see that the first four rightly guided caliphs, as they are called, were each brought forward in different ways. One emerged from a meeting of the elders. One was nominated. One emerged from a shura council, nominated, appointed by his predecessor. And then the fourth emerged through what we can call the general public acclaim of the people. But in each of these four cases, the one who emerged as leader was put to the people for their affirmation. Now, this isn't quite as simple as it seems, because obviously people would have tribal affiliations, people would come from certain communities and follow certain leaders and so on. But you can see the model that the proposed leader was put to the people, and the people then acclaimed and gave their assent. Now, for Muslim scholars who talk about Islamic democracy, then this is an important model, that power, as it were, comes from the people within the guidance of Qur'an and Sunnah, and is then vested in the leader, and then the people are obliged to follow that leader. A different model can be seen within the Shia community, because at the heart of the Shia understanding is that after the death of the Prophet, God had ordained that certain people should lead the community, and that these people were equipped with knowledge, with the highest spiritual qualities, in order that they should infallibly guide the community through divine appointment. These were the Imams. And we have that hadith, which is central to Shia understanding, that the Prophet said, "After I go, I leave amongst you two things that are most precious. One is the book, the Qur'an, and the other is the family of the Prophet, from which the Imams are drawn." Now then, in Shia understanding, this means that we continue with one person as leader after the time of Prophet Muhammad, and this person is the Imam, who has a special light, a knowledge, a guidance, and inspiration from God to guide the community infallibly along the right path. Now, this then continues for just over 300 years until 941, when the 12th Imam goes into occultation, is no longer available directly to guide the community, and that is the period in which we now live until the return of the 12th Imam as Imam al-Mahdi, at which time he will again take up that infallible, inspired leadership of the community. So we can see two different models there within Islamic political thought. Whenever we talk about having a revealed text that lays down the boundaries for the way in which the community should be guided and governed, it immediately raises the question, who says what the text means? Who interprets the text? Now, in an age in which we do not have the Prophet, in the Shia tradition we do not have the infallible Imams with us on hand, this task of interpretation falls to those who are most learned. Learning, wisdom, piety all go hand in hand. So within the Sunni system, the ulama, the learned ones within the community, have a responsibility for interpreting the text and helping people to see the right guidance in every new situation. Within the Shia community, this task is performed in particular by the Grand Ayatollahs, the Marjas, whose responsibility it is to give guidance to be worthy of being followed by the ordinary members of the Shia community. So we can see that we have this question of interpreting the text and applying it anew in each situation. And that necessarily raises the question, how static is the text, and therefore how static is that interpretation, or how dynamic is the text, and therefore how dynamic can that interpretation be within the confines of the text, which is itself a dynamic entity. And so we can see that different Muslim societies around the world have developed in different ways around these kind of questions. Now, I want to take two contemporary Islamic societies as models for the ways in which this sort of Islamic political thinking has been put into practice, and we can see the structures as they evolve. First of all, let's take Pakistan. Remember, Pakistan in 1947 is created from those parts of the Indian subcontinent in which a majority of people were Muslims. But from the very beginning and all the way through its history, a hotly controverted question has been, Is Islam to be there as a homeland for Muslims, or is it to be there as an Islamic state? What is the role that Islam is to play within that society? And going along with that, who is the guardian of Islam within that society? Is it to be done by the traditional ulama, who perhaps have little expertise in the business of guiding a modern state, the affairs of politics and of world affairs, or should it be done by some other body? Now, the way that this was developed in Pakistan was to establish an Islamic Advisory Council. And their job was to advise the government on the Islamic credentials of proposed policies and to indicate possible ways forward for developing the country along Islamic lines. They had their own research institute, the Central Institute of Islamic Research, that was there to do the backroom work in coming forward and developing laws that were in accordance with Islamic teaching. Of course, these laws then have to be passed by a parliament. The parliament is elected by the people. So it is the people who have the duty to put into power the politicians who they think will best implement Islamic guidance in their society. Now, that model is a model that is often today called that of political Islam. The principle here being that Islam is guidance for a complete way of life. This means that if we are to have true Islam, we need an Islamic society, an Islamic state, which passes Islamic laws that are based on the principles found in Qur'an and Sunnah, and that those laws are then enforced, and the enforcement of those laws will help people to grow and develop in a better way as Muslims. So the laws become the engine of change within the society. Now we can see this being played out not only in Pakistan, but in that movement that we generally call the Arab Spring, we can see the part played by political Islam in various countries. And we can see that there's quite a degree of difference and variety there between, let's say, the Al-Naqda party in Tunisia and the kind of constitution that was brought in by President Morsi in Egypt. That was inspired by the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood traced themselves to their founder, Hassan al-Banna, who was one of the great pioneers of this way of thinking of Islam as a complete package, therefore having political power within the society to bring in Islamic laws. His counterpart in terms of this way of thinking in Pakistan was Maududi. Maududi was a little later. He died in 1979, whereas Hassan al-Banna died in 1948. But the same way of thinking is there to allow Islam to be the solution to every question asked in a modern Islamic state. If we turn now for our second example and take it from the Shia tradition, we can look at the Islamic Republic of Iran after 1979, the Islamic Revolution, which was led and inspired by Ayatollah Khomeini. Ayatollah Khomeini's understanding was to develop a truly religious democracy which could develop in Iran, in which the overwhelming majority of the people took their Islam seriously and were religious people. Therefore, they wanted to obey God and to live in accordance with God's decrees. But how was that to be worked out? The way that this was developed then in the Iranian context was to establish a parliament which was elected by the popular vote of the people. This was made up of a whole variety of different people with different expertise, with different fields of experience. They were there to listen to the people, to listen to their collective voice, their collective conscience, if you like. And on the basis of this, they were to bring forward laws that met the needs of the people. These laws, then, were to be sent to the Board of Guardians for scrutiny. The Board of Guardians was made up of people who were experts in Islamic law, and they were to scrutinize these laws and address the question whether or not they were acceptable within the confines of Islamic law, the confines of the revealed text of the Qur'an. Now, Ayatollah Khomeini pointed out that Sharia is a dynamic concept. It is not static and fixed in an earlier period, but there is the capacity for it to develop in a new system, in a new society. And so that was the task of the Board of Guardians. Now, if they approved of the law, then it could go through the system and enter into the law of the land. If, however, they found problems with it, they were to send it back to the Parliament in order that they could think again under the guidance of the Board of Guardians. If the Parliament accepted the guidance of the Board of Guardians, then obviously they would change the law and they would bring it forward again for approval and it would enter into legislation. But if it happened that they couldn't resolve the will of the people and the guidance that they had received from the Board of Guardians, then the law was referred to a higher council. This was called the Expediency Council, where you had people who had great experience in running the country and great expertise in the various branches of knowledge, and they were then to sit and act as an arbitration council, if necessary consulting the supreme leader, in order that this law could then be passed if it was in accordance with the accumulated wisdom of Islam and the collective conscience of the people. And so we see a system of checks and balances at which the voice of the people and their conscience under God, the teaching of Islam, the wisdom of the scholars, under different levels of scrutiny, ultimately under the supreme leader himself, ensured that the country developed in the best possible way in a new form of religious democracy. Now, if we survey Islamic history, we can see that there have actually been very short periods of time when these ideals of Islamic political thought have actually been unanimously lived out in practice. The United Caliphate was a very short-run affair. We found that throughout history we had different caliphates that are often more geographically orientated. So we had the Abbasids from Baghdad, the Umayyads in Spain, the Fatimids in Egypt, the Safavids in Iran. We have the Alawids today based in Morocco and West Africa. And the largest and longest lived of all these caliphates, the Ottoman Empire, which finally is closed down in 1924. So we don't have that pan-national Islamic empire system anymore in practice. Instead, what we have and what we've had down through many centuries within Islam are a whole variety of different forms of governance. We have kings and sultans and emirs. We have different forms of presidential rule, of military rule, and we have different forms of democracies. And so there's a whole melange of different forms of Islamic leadership and Islamic governance within the world. There are some countries in the world that use the word Islam in their title, the Islamic Republic of. But this must not be interpreted to mean that therefore automatically the way of life in that place, the legal system in that place, the political system is wholly in accordance with Islam. Sometimes quite a long way from it. In fact, no serious modern scholar would say that there is any country in the world today that fully and completely operates according to the ideals of Islamic political thought. This is a kind of work in progress where people are trying to work out how should we live according to the principles of Islam politically in the world today. Every Muslim has the responsibility of living according to God's guidance. This is a responsibility which is still there whether one lives in a Muslim majority country or in any other country around the world. Today, one of the interesting phenomena is that there are millions and millions of Muslims around the world who are living in mixed societies in which they're living and sharing territory and a political system together with non-Muslims. In this situation, they are still ultimately accountable to God for the way in which they live their lives. Part of that accountability is that they should do all that they can to promote good within that society and to oppose evil within that society. Well, where do they get their understanding of what is good and what is evil from? Well, they derive it from the sources of Islam, from the Qur'an, from the teaching of the Prophet, from the collective wisdom down through the centuries. And they are to struggle, first of all, to live by that themselves. Now, living by that, the Sharia tells us that every Muslim who is a citizen of a country must obey all the laws of the country in which they live, in all things that are godly, in all things that do not contradict the law of God. In other words, a Muslim, like other people from different religious traditions, will always have an ultimate authority to whom they are accountable, and that is to God. And so if the law of the land required a Muslim to do something that was fundamentally against the law of God, then such a person would have to refuse and take the consequences of refusing it. You can put me into prison if you want to, but ultimately I must obey God and my conscience and refuse to do this thing. Now, living in a mixed society is perfectly possible, and being a citizen there requires that Muslims should play an active part in the political life of that society, seeking to engage in politics, in public debate, in standing for office, in seeking to help to change that society for the good of human beings, not just for the good of the Muslims who live there. So being politically active, being active in terms of voting, participating, campaigning, is part of promoting the good and forbidding the evil in the society in which we live. Ultimately, Muslims are required to live out their Islam, not just to talk about it or to be Muslim in private behind closed doors. Next week, we'll be looking at ethical principles in Islam. I look forward to seeing you again then.